Teamwork for inviting me. Let me thank Newslaundry for this opportunity. And of course, old partners of ours, Konrad-Adenauer, for supporting what I believe is a very important conversation, especially to be had with an Indian audience. I think what happens in Europe is going to implicate much of what is transpiring in Asia and certainly in India. And while the Americans and the Chinese may be the most important geopolitical agents, I certainly believe that EU will have an impact on the decade that is now unfolding. The next 10 years will certainly be a period when the middle powers and the reluctant powers, countries like Australia, India, and the reluctant power like EU, will have to find new ways of negotiating and maneuvering geopolitically, economically, and also socially, as these two overbearing giants begin to exert influence, positive and negative, on all of us. We have a stellar panel which has been introduced. And I think Pankaj has laid out pretty much the outline of what we would like to discuss. We would like to discuss what's happening within Europe, the economic differences between, say, the North and the South in Europe, the political differences between the East and West in Europe, and everything out of control in the middle of Europe. We would also like to discuss the European relationship with its most important transatlantic partner, the United States, and how is the Trump presidency impacted this particular relationship, what is going to happen post the elections. And of course, we are going to discuss Europe's old suspicion of Russia and how it sees Putin's gambits implicating European future. But most importantly, we are also going to discuss the most difficult relationship Europe seems to be having today, the one that it is struggling to maintain and keep, the one that keeps it satiated with trade and economics, but also the one that scares it with its political posture, the one it shares with China. And let me first start with the European relationship with China, simply because we are largely engaging with an Indian audience, and I think that's on topmost on most of their minds. And let me begin with James Crabtree. James, you tweeted that can European countries take their nascent resolve against China and make it into a geopolitical posture in Asia? I'm assuming you are suggesting that can Europe coalesce and become an actor in the Indo-Pacific, or maybe even beyond. So James, let me pose your own question to you. Can Europe build agency to be an important and influential force in the Indo-Pacific, which is pretty much the front line of the old and new world today?
Right. Thanks, Samir, and thanks for the introduction. Thanks for having me. That's exactly the argument that I want to make. I mean, just briefly to begin, there's a view, it's held in India, it's held all around Asia, that Europe is basically a sideshow in this coming geopolitical conflict. And to some degree, that's Europe's own fault, because Europe isn't playing the same game that all of the other big powers are playing. But you've seen over the last year or two, in its own way, an appreciable toughening of Europe's position, particularly on China. So the most significant geopolitical shift coming out of the kind of post-COVID era has been India. And so India's move away from China is probably the most significant and long-lasting. But actually, the European Union, and particularly Germany, has become much more skeptical of Europe. There was an important paper that was published at the end of 2019 where Europe said China was a strategic rival for the first time. It's been a little bit backwards and forwards, but basically the direction of travel is pretty clear, that the European Union is becoming much tougher on China. The problem is that this toughness is mostly a defensive toughness. It's about industrial policy. It's about worrying about the Belt and Road Initiative, having China kind of meddling in Eastern Europe. It isn't a kind of an offensive toughness. Still, the European Union doesn't really have strategy in the Pacific. Still, the European Union, particularly Germany, is still too het up on it, protecting its trading relationship with China. And I think the opportunity for Europe, and it's a perfectly plausible opportunity, is for Europe to have a proper geopolitical Indo-Pacific strategy in which the European Union begins to spend serious money having a position in Asia. And Europe has vital strategic interests here. This is not just where the crucible of future geostrategic competition. It's also where the next stage of the rules-based order, the system of multilateralism that Europe says it believes in, is going to be crafted. And so if Europe isn't here, then it's not going to have a seat at the table. What does that mean? I mean, partly it means getting a military presence out here, and that means, in a sense, France and the United Kingdom in particular being persuaded to be a kind of middle power in this part of the world. Not a big power, but a middle power. But it also means money. If China can be spending billions of dollars on the Belt and Road Initiative in Europe's backyard, then there's absolutely no reason why rich countries like Europe can't be beginning to be part of the coalition that offers a financial alternative to BRI, along with India, Australia, Japan, and the United States. And I suppose all that this requires, I think, I mean, this is a serious undertaking, but it requires political will. But in a sense, this is Europe's next big geopolitical challenge. I mean, it does have a lot of other problems, particularly Russia on its doorstep. But I think the European Union now needs to kind of, roll up its sleeves and decide to become an Indo-Pacific player.
James, you very casually normalized in your remarks UK and France as being part of the Europe you are talking about. Is that simple a relationship today? And I'm putting you on the spot, I know, but I want to ask you that. Do you believe that it is possible that EU may not be a part of the geopolitical action in the Indo-Pacific, but UK might, or vice versa?
I mean, I think it's just a reality, right? So these relationships are very complicated because of Brexit. They're fluid, and you have to treat them realistically. Neither the UK or France is a first-rate global navy anymore, and that's what we're talking about. It has to be maritime power. There's only two European countries that have serious naval presences. So you play with the cards that you have, and both France and the UK and Germany, which released an Indo-Pacific strategy only last week, want to be players in this part of the world. Britain, because of its post-Brexit sort of slightly fanciful ideas about Asian trade. France has a very large actually geographic footprint in this part of the world because of all of its islands. And so, in a sense, that's what you're playing with. There's no point pretending that Spain and Portugal are going to have a significant military presence in Asia. You've got to go with what you've got, and so I think, in a sense, that's what you have to go with.
So what I hear is that we will still see the sovereigns within Europe play the more active geopolitical role, even as EU as a collective plays the more defensive, aggressive role in terms of protecting the economic trade and other values architecture, right? I mean, I think that's the point you're trying to make.
Yeah, but I think that's true in the Indo-Pacific in general, right? I mean, you have some multilateralism, some bilateralism, some trilateralism. I mean, it's a big mess, right? The world that we're moving into. And so it seems to me perfectly plausible that you could have a European Union umbrella in which there's a role for the UK and French military. And, there are ways of doing this if there's political will to make it happen and a realization of how important it is. And the problem is, at the moment, that political will hasn't, it's moving gradually, but not fast enough.
Tara, let me come to you. You said in Paris you managed this very nifty institute out of Paris, working on foreign policy and foreign relations. Let me ask you that question. Sitting in my seat, when I read signals coming out of Paris and France, I see French exceptionalism at play. French want to be different when it comes to engaging with China, which basically leaves most of us wondering what the hell do they want with China. Sometimes it seems that they are apologizing for being tough with China. Sometimes they are all embracing the Chinese propositions. Where do you assess Paris in terms of its relationship with China today in 2020?
So, hi everyone. Thanks, Samir, for the question. I should just say my 3-year-old daughter is running around, so there might be some noise and craziness at some point. I apologize in advance for that. I'm not so sure that there is French exceptionalism when it comes to China. There might have been French exceptionalism at some point when it came to European foreign policy, and that is also, things have turned massively around with COVID. But I would say in terms of the relationship with China, Macron was very clear since he arrived in 2017 that he wanted to Europeanize the answer to China's offensive. And so in March 2019, right before communication on China saying that it was a systemic rival, Macron hosted Xi Jinping in Paris, and he actually called Jean-Claude Juncker, who was then the Commission President, and Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, and this bilateral visit between France and China turned into a European visit. And when he again went to China later that year, he brought a German minister with him in the delegation. And I think he's been very clear that it can only be a European answer, that none of the member states of the European Union are strong enough to answer that. And there needs to be a strategy of what the EU wants to do. And what is really fascinating to me is that he's been calling for European sovereignty and European strategic autonomy, which we can define as acting independently in an interdependent world for over 3 years now. He's been doing what I've called the Macron method, which is really rocking the boat, being super tough with partners, saying that NATO is brain dead. He's been hammering these things to his partner, and I think provoking some frustration and understandable frustration with European partners into what the French wanted to achieve. And what is quite fascinating is that he's been saying since Trump was elected, we need to be careful about what the transatlantic relationship means today, what the US partner wants to do with us. And a number of countries, especially NATO members, have been quite angry at France for that. And we're seeing some European strategic autonomy building up since the beginning of the COVID crisis. And it was not so much finally a reaction to what our American partner and ally has been doing to us for the past 3.5 years, but what China has been doing. So disinformation campaigns, information manipulation, sending outdated equipment to a number of European countries when it came to masks and tests. And these extremely violent campaigns have actually finally triggered an official reaction by France. And I think that was felt quite strongly.
So, Tara, let me pose to you two questions that have actually been posed by the audience, but kind of fit into what I was going to ask you in any case. The first, of course, is that even as Macron tries to build a European response, EU response to China, as you outlined in your initial remarks, it is also quite clear that France is also going on its own. You have recently seen the India-Australia-France partnership that is emerging, maritime exercises, the India-French partnership that is booming, the French desire to be an Indo-Pacific power, and looking for ways to be influential in this region. What is driving this impulse in the minds of Quai d'Orsay? And second, do you truly believe that the coronavirus may have stopped the salami slicing of Europe by the Chinese agenda?
So on the first question, I think
both of these are from the audience. Both of these are from the audience. So we are starting right in. We are bringing people in. So guys, all of you who are watching on the Media Rumble website, please post your comments and questions, and we are going to take them as they come in. We are going to make this an interactive conversation. Tara.
Sure. Two great questions. On the Indo-Pacific, I think James laid it out quite well. I mean, France has a number of geographic, economic interests there. And it's been very clear, the strategy that it's been pushing and that you're talking about is more of a military strategy. Mm-hmm. And I think there is, of course, an issue in the Indo-Pacific about maritime security. But the idea that the French, and not only the French, have about the Indo-Pacific and building a European strategy for the Indo-Pacific is to Europeanize and to kind of create a strategy of which the military would be one brick of. And there would be other bricks. Climate, biodiversity, the blue economy, and actually creating a European connectivity agenda for the Indo-Pacific. And that would mean infrastructure, 5G, very concrete things in which there could be a European and Asian cooperation, in which I think France and India would play a big role. And that's pretty obvious to me. But I think, and it's quite interesting, so the Germans released policy guidelines last week, 2 weeks ago, and not a strategy. And I think the Europeans are looking into building a strategy now. But even what the Germans did, I think in terms of messaging was really good, because they released these policy guidelines, which are for now more of a shopping list, but it's an interesting shopping list. It's still not a strategy, but they released it 1 week after Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister's visit to Europe. And so they hosted Wang Yi in Berlin. He was in Paris too. And then they released that. And the fact that there was this calendar messaging, I think, was very strong on the part of the Germans. They are holding the EU presidency right now. That is quite important. There is a lot bearing on their shoulders in terms of Brexit negotiation, putting the recovery plan of the EU post-COVID, and trying to find a strategy towards Asia. And I think France is always going to have this particular role. It wants to build this strategic partnership with India that it has. They have a very strong military and defense cooperation that is not going to go away. And I'm pretty sure that France wants to expand that partnership. But in the same way as we've Europeanized our China policy, I think it really makes sense for France, if it wants to be this European foreign policy leader that it aims to be, that it Europeanizes its relationship to India too, and that it includes it into this larger Indo-Pacific strategy. Your second question, sorry, was about
if coronavirus the end of the salami slicing of Europe by China, or do you think it's got aggravated and you are in greater threat today?
No, I mean, I don't know that it's the end of the salami slicing, but there is certainly an awareness campaign of the salami slicing and a decision-making process that has been accelerated in a way that we have never seen in the 70 years of the European construction.
Okay.
In 2019, there is this idea that we label China as a systemic rival. So now the EU will also have to ask itself how it can square the circle of both wanting to be a strategic partner and a systemic rival. I don't think that's going to work anymore. And this is what the EU is struggling and going through. So we might, what will happen is that we'll agree that China is a competitor, that China is a rival, and so that it's not a partner anymore, but it might be a member of the international stage with whom we have to cooperate on a few issues. And that's quite different, cooperating with someone and being their partner and their strategic partner is quite different. So what the EU is saying is that we need to keep China in the climate negotiations, and that's absolutely true. But China is not going to replace the US in our partnership, and I think that's been made very clear. And the whole process of investment screening, investment protection, into the EU that has already been launched since last year is going to be accelerated now. And I think the way we've seen what Ursula von der Leyen, when she arrived last year as Commission President, said was that she wanted for this to be a geopolitical commission. I think after the initial struggle of the COVID crisis management in the EU, there's been a very strong leadership from her and from Charles Michel, the President of the EU Council, into presenting a coordinated face and a coordinated message. So there was an EU-China summit on June 22nd earlier this year, where they were very strong-headed against the Chinese position. The same happened last week, or earlier, on Monday actually, earlier this week, where Angela Merkel, Ursula von der Leyen, and Charles Michel also spoke to Chinese President Xi Jinping, and I think they have this quite firm European response. And this is changing little by little. So I have to say I'm quite hopeful for the future. Everything is not solved, but we are getting there.
Great, thanks. Let me move to Juuli. Juuli, my favorite country, Estonia, the digital capital of the world, something that had bet on digital utopia. The digital is now weaponized. You are having to take sides. Technology is the tip of the spear of geopolitics today. The 5G wars, the digital media apps, the mobile phone apps, everything is today political. How does a country like Estonia see its future in this highly supercharged geopolitical technology ecosystem? As a European hub of technology, are you ready to make some tough choices at this time?
Thank you, first of all, to the organizers for inviting me to speak at this very distinguished panel. And thanks for the question also, Samir. I just quickly, if you allow me, skip back to the China question and the East and West divide and salami tactics. So Estonia is one of the countries who is part of the 17+1. But during the recent developments in the world, we are also actually seeing more added value in the dialogue between EU 27 plus China rather than 17+1. And I guess it might be the case also amongst the other member states from the 17+1 formation. So let's see about these developments. I also followed the outcomes of the EU-China meeting that happened last week. And I think the press statement by President of the Council of the EU was very clear that the EU needs to be a player rather than a playing field, and Europe wants to have more reciprocity, responsibility, and basic fairness in the relationship with China. So I wouldn't say that there is any naivety in the understanding of the EU towards China, and also it's a good momentum for tightening the relationship between the EU and India. I think. Coming to the technology and Estonia being having a very good reputation in this field, I think we had a very successful presidency in the UN Security Council in May, while we had to quickly shift to all the meetings happening online, virtually, rather than people gathering in the headquarters in New York. We had cybersecurity discussion, and domestically, we've decided to implement 5G by 2023 in the bigger towns or cities. We're so small, so it's difficult to call any Estonian city or town a city. And also in the previous commission, our commissioner was responsible for the digital single market.
You didn't tell me who is going to be implementing the 5G in the cities and towns. I think that's the question.
Yes, so we have implemented the regulation, government regulation, which basically states that the construction will be carried out by a reliable partner, by a partner that our partners in the EU and NATO.
Super. So now you have also chosen the Indian way of not saying anything. Like, and you have to, okay.
2.5 years have had its impact, right? So now we have a regulation basically that allows us to choose which way to go, and of course we want to go the safe way. And concerning the Estonia-China relations, once more, for us we have very little dependence, although we share a neighbor. For us it's not so difficult of decision to decide whether we think that the 17+1 is more important than the 27+1 for us. And on technology, again, I was following the speech by the president of the European Commission on 16th of September, and I think a big part of his speech, and quite in the beginning, it was a long one, but it was devoted to the digital transformation, and I think the EU in general is taking it very seriously. It's not just Estonia, but of course in e-governance, it has been much easier for us than a lot of countries, because we sort of skipped some phases after we restored our independence in 1991 and went straight to digital, because we're not, it's a small country, but it's not so well connected, and we don't have resources to build government offices in each and every single small village. So it's better to provide the services online. And also we've calculated that the e-governance solutions that Estonia uses in 99% of its government services have saved us approximately 2% of GDP annually. So this is something that we can contribute to defense, which we have already.
Juuli, let me ask you a question that someone in the audience has posed, and it's interesting, and I'll be happy if James and Tara want to come in and quickly pitch in as well with short views of their own. But Juuli, the question is that Indian television media is channeling some of our most bigoted, polarized views, tendencies. The society is divided. How much role is digital media and digital discourse? How much role does it have in creating the European divide that Pankaj was outlining, the political divides, the societal divides? The digital transformation project, is it also leading to digital divisions? I think that's the first part of the question. And the second, is there a woke versus the boomer divide in Europe? like it is in the US. So are you also seeing a generational divide playing out in Europe? And I want this to be something that Juuli, Tara, and James jump into, and then I'm going to pose a few questions to Ambassador Mohan Kumar, who was our ambassador in Paris, and I'm going to pose him some of what you told me is going to now come to him, and I'm going to ask him his views on that. So Juuli, Tara, and James, the role of media in dividing Europe or creating illiberal tendencies, and is there a generational divide in Europe vis-a-vis the partnerships and foreign policy and also economic choices? Juuli.
Thanks. Both very interesting questions. I think in Europe, what makes a big difference is that the media is sort of like actually in India also the media is sort of a bit divided because it's different languages in different member states, but one of the values, and values are the things that we speak about today, is freedom, and freedom of speech is part of it. And I think it's about it's on the member states to see and decide how where the balance at the end of the day comes, and how much they can restrict it. But of course, when big elections come, it's always a little tricky to keep the let's say fake news out.
And what about the generational divide? Do you and your parents agree on everything?
On digital, I mean, we have a WhatsApp group, and my parents are very okay with the digitalization.
I think WhatsApp is where all of us converge. Tara and James, let me come to you on the same question.
I think it's a really interesting question that you've asked, because compared to the US and India, media and kind of extremist right-wing nationalist media is a kind of less remarked upon a factor in European division. It is true that you get, there's some right-wing television, and social media in general doesn't help unity anywhere. But compared to, Arnab and Sean Hannity, I think you wouldn't hear people talking about media so much. That's partly because in Europe, you still thankfully have in many countries a good tradition of public service media. It's also because there isn't one European media. You have a Polish media and a British media and whatnot. And I think in Europe, the sources of these divisions, you would more likely look at the economic divisions that have led to the rise of nationalism, but also cultural divisions, in particular migration, inward migration into Europe, both from outside and within the bloc. I think those are probably more important, but social media for sure doesn't help.
Thanks. And Tara, a quick intervention, and then we are going to go to Mr. Kumar, Ambassador Mohan Kumar.
So I think there is, first of all, a big difference between mainstream, old media and social media. I would refer you to a study that was released by the think tank called More in Common last year, called The Perception Gap, How False Impressions Are Driving Americans Apart. It was on the US, but I think it's a conclusion that you can draw on a number of other countries, where it basically says that on social media, there's this echo chamber phenomena. And so you get to read basically more of what you've already read. And so it gives you the impression that everything that you're reading is what everyone else is thinking. Or quite the contrary, if you're only following people who you disagree with, you have the impression that the whole world is actually following their view. And this perception gap is actually accelerating the polarization between people, and has direct consequences on elections, on who is getting elected, who is heading countries. And this is something that I don't know of yet that there is a solution to, and which is a bit scary. And we can clearly see that happening in Europe too. I think James is right. It's not exactly the same type of media, but you can also see all the disinformation campaigns that are led by foreign media. So RT and Sputnik, for instance, that are Russian media, they're really disseminating fake news basically every day, and targeting a number of populations who would have access again to quite a little bit of information. In terms of the generational divide, I think what we're seeing quite a lot in Europe is the divide around climate. Climate is becoming a core issue to a number of the younger generations, and I think it has consequences on the social system, the economic system, our outreach to the rest of the world, and how Europe sees its place in the world. And I guess the older generations are not always understanding how this has become a core issue to the younger generations. You can see the divide on that.
Ambassador, let me turn to you, and my apologies, it took a little longer getting to you, but I saved the best for the last. And I want to have a fairly in-depth conversation with you, pose a number of questions to you. The first, of course, sir, as I warned you early on, sitting in New Delhi, someone who's intimately engaged with that particular part of the world, what are the messages we should be catching on to? What are we hearing? Or what should we be hearing today as we sit in New Delhi and try and assess the relationship going ahead?
So thank you very much for having me, and no problem at all. I found it equally fascinating to listen to the three panelists. I was enjoying it, actually. I want to begin by making an admission. From the Indian policy planning perspective with which I was associated when I was ambassador, two important strategic challenges have come about for India that we did not anticipate fully. One is the Sino-Russian rapprochement, which may or may not be heading towards an alliance. This will have profound impact on the way we can execute foreign policy. But the second, which is more relevant for this session, is the fundamental inability/unwillingness of European Union to adopt a pole position in the international landscape. You know, when I was ambassador in Paris and we were doing the climate change negotiations, and when I saw the Sino-US statement, joint statement 3 months before the climate change accords, which pretty much set the tone,
Correct.
I really thought Henry Kissinger's G2 is coming true. Now, a variety of factors that has not come true. But the fact that EU is not in a pole position, I want to emphasize to you and the panelists and the audience that it completely constricts the strategic space for maneuver for India. We have to now keep getting buffeted between two giants and what's happening on the border, etc. That's the first thing I will say. The sitting from India, we see EU as being heavily distracted by the corona and by Brexit. And that might explain why they are not able to occupy pole position. I too listened to read the speech and actually went through it with a fine tooth comb. Ursula von der Leyen's State of the Union address. She wants a geopolitical commission. This would be India's dream, for the EU geopolitical commission to come into place. It's nowhere near true. But having said that, what are the signs and what are the areas that we should be doing? I think we are also not being, we should have exploited opportunities. I always never fail to emphasize that we made nothing short of a blunder in not finalizing the FTA with Europe. Mm-hmm. All negotiators tell me we were this close to doing it. We should have done it. Climate change is an area where we should be consulting closely with EU. Von der Leyen's carbon border adjustment tax worries the hell out of me, because it will impact a country like India enormously, whether we like it or not. Digital, the kind of regulatory framework that India has in mind is very close to the European Union's GDPR. I mean, you know this better than anybody else because you are an illustrious member of the Cybersecurity Commission. So I think we should be consulting more closely with them. 5G and tech, we should be, again, doing things together. For example, it's beyond me why we don't consult more closely with EU on WTO. Mm-hmm. Americans are not able to, we have not been able to convince the Americans that we are a developing country. And the Americans constantly put India and China together in the same basket. Now, this is an area where the EU is likely to be much more understanding where India is coming from. So I think some of these areas, we need a much stronger conversation with EU. The signs we are getting from EU is they are extremely favorable to India. Because of the disenchantment with China, I don't want to make this sound like a zero-sum game, but it's a fact that their relatively recent disillusionment with China has made them now look at India. Maybe this is a partner we can do business with. France has been way ahead of the other countries. That is something I must tell you. They've been way ahead of other countries in terms of strategic cooperation with India. I'm particularly delighted that Germany is following suit. UK is now out of EU. So I'm going to stop here and say that there are a lot of things that we should be doing with EU as well.
No, Ambassador Mohan, I'm going to ask you a couple of more questions, and then I'm going to take your responses to the rest of the panelists as we begin to move to the last part of our conversations. So first question to you, sir. Has India overcome its hesitation of working with Brussels? Or are we still reluctant partners to Brussels and warm partners to other capitals in the region? So that's the first question to you. The second is, if you were the policy advisor to Macron or to Merkel or to even Prime Minister Johnson, how would you advise them in their dealings with two actors, Russia and US today? I think these are two important. We spoke about China. What would be your advice to these leaders in terms of how they should manage the Russia relationship if we are to prevent that horrible eventuality of a Sino-Russian nexus or axis or even an entente, which is dangerous? And what should they do about their transatlantic partnership? We seem to have more faith in the US today than perhaps many European leaders do. So let me pose these questions to you, and then let me come back on the other side.
Sorry, the first question, please, again.
That has India overcome its reluctance around Brussels?
Yes, thank you very much, and excellent questions. I really must compliment you for this. First, the response to the first question, honest answer. I'm out of government, so I think I can be more honest now than before. We find...
Sir, let me warn you, you might be back in government, so be careful. So
we find enormous comfort dealing with Paris, Berlin,
and London.
Now no longer London, than Brussels. This is a fact. Enormous comfort. Just going to the Quai d'Orsay, dealing with the National Security Advisor, the Foreign Secretary, exactly the same page. There are no issues. With Brussels, I don't blame them, because we have, first of all, you're not dealing with one actor. You're dealing at least with 3 actors at a time. And frankly, I'm going to put my young colleague from Estonia on the mat. Does anybody in Estonia really, is he or she really concerned about India? I'd like to ask her that, but I'm sorry, I don't mean to put you on the mat. So we have that.
No worries.
If you belong to Hungary or Poland or Estonia, or I don't know, you look at India and then you look at China and say, hey, listen, we're getting goodies from China. Why bother about India? So India is some tourist exotic destination where you go. Maybe I'm provoking her, but that's partly the intention. So my answer to the first question, much better to deal with Paris, Berlin at this point. But I think we are developing more comfort with Brussels. That's one. The second, what would I advise, Macron or Merkel? I would be very blunt, of course. One, you simply have to accept that Russia is a European power. You cannot do this. You cannot treat a country which has a great civilization, great power. I'm not saying it's perfect, but you don't do this. You don't treat them like a pariah and really you are edging them out in so many ways. So that is the first. As far as China is concerned, I think they don't need much advice now. My own feeling is in the last 6 months, they've seen China for what it is. I don't think India needs to say anything more, frankly. You could have never imagined a Chinese foreign minister going to Berlin and the Germans sticking him off for saying what he said about the Czech, the Senate president going to Taiwan. Such a thing would have been inconceivable when I was ambassador in Paris, frankly. So
and advise about the US to them. What advice would you give to them? About
transatlantic relationship, I would tell EU that just separate the chaff from the grain, from the rhetoric from the substance. Deal with the substance. And the substance is, you may not like Mr. Trump, but I think EU should spend more on defense. This is what he's saying. Absolutely correct. There is the doubt about it. On trade, there is the USTR, which needs to be handled. We have the same problem with USTR as well. So we deal with it. But having said that, areas like digital services tax, there is a problem. And that is where I think if you can get together with India and other countries, maybe then we can form a united front vis-a-vis United States. But I do believe with United States, I mean, we haven't come to that segment of the discussion, but since you've given me the floor, I'll say this and then shut up. As far as United States is concerned, I really do believe that it looks much worse than it is. The transatlantic relationship, to my mind, is still retrievable in my view. And I'm not saying, if Biden comes to power or Trump comes to power. I think there is a realization, even in the United States, that for some things, you have to go back to the EU. Otherwise, it's not going to work. I'll stop here, but thank you so much.
No, thank you, Ambassador. Let me come back to James. James, the transatlantic relationship is better than the world imagines it to be. Don't push Russia into the Chinese corner. Treat them like a European actor. Create a new framework of engagement with them. That's advice from Ambassador Mohan Kumar. How would you, what would you add to that? Or how would you change it or shape it?
Yeah, I thought those were terrific remarks from Mohan. I didn't really disagree with them, so forcefully put. This is complicated, isn't it? So let's imagine Biden wins. So Biden is going to be tougher on Russia, we think, and maybe a little easier on China, although he says he isn't going to be easier on China, but probably a little bit easier. You have to try and do something on climate change in particular. And so that certainly complicates India's strategic position, but it also complicates the EU strategic position. But it means that the transatlantic bond will be stronger, and in a sense, it's good for Europe that the United States will be tougher on Russia. But that then changes the calculus with respect to China. So you sort of win with one hand and you lose with the other. But I think I agree with Mohan that in the end, Gideon Rachman, my former colleague at the FT, wrote a column about this a couple of months ago. In the end, Europe isn't going to side with China. It may be that it has a close transatlantic relationship with the United States, or it might be that it has a strained and complicated relationship with the United States. But I find it very hard to imagine the European Union becoming a kind of balancer between the two and conceiving of its interest that way. And that's particularly so given the direction of travel both in Berlin and in Paris, but also under von der Leyen. I mean, it's interesting when you look at Europe, when Mohan was talking about dealing with Brussels, there is a difference in leadership. Part of the reason why the last commission, and I should credit actually the European Council on Foreign Relations, Tara's organization.
You have a minute.
Had a big influence on pushing the last commission to being more firm on China. Then there was a little bit of a wobble before COVID, and then we've sort of moved back to being a little bit tougher. But you have to deal with each commission. But no, I basically agree with Mohan that the EU and the US will in some form or another fall together.
Thank you. Tara, 2 minutes to you. The final 2 minutes to you. The Ambassador Mohan Kumar's suggestions for Europe. How would you respond to those?
I hope that the transatlantic relationship can get better, and there is this idea that if it's Biden who wins, then the transatlantic relationship will be back on track. And that if it's Trump, then the European sovereignty agenda might prevail. Actually, I'd like to make the counter argument that with Biden, the European sovereignty agenda might prevail too. I'm not sure that the EU would be his main area of focus. I think there would be a better relationship within the NATO framework, that's for sure. But in terms of the rest, I guess he would be more focused on getting the Asia pivot back on track, being focused on the Asia Pacific, the Indo-Pacific region. I'm not sure that European security would be his priority. It is the Obama administration that implemented sanctions against the European economy and a number of European companies, so that might happen again. And that we're talking about, economic coercion, economic extraterritorial sanctions. So let's see. And there is a big question about Trump too. We've seen with populists that when they are re-elected for a second mandate, they usually double down on their agenda. With Trump, we don't know if doubling down on China means breaking a deal with them or going to war with them. We don't know if it means with Europeans being tougher on them or getting the transatlantic relationship back on track. We're still in this unpredictability that is actually quite terrifying, and that for sure should force the Europeans to define their strategic interests, define their strategic partners, and I hope that they will do that for the Indo-Pacific region.
And what about Russia?
Russia has been a complicated actor on the European soil. I mean, they tried to assassinate Navalny, a political opponent, just a few days ago. You know, he was in a coma. He was brought to Germany. He seems to be recuperating little by little. But this is what we're talking about: disinformation campaigns, assassination attempts on the European soil. Very tough on all the security issues that matter to Europeans in their neighborhood, to the east, to the south. I'm talking about Syria, I'm talking about Libya, I'm talking about Ukraine, I'm talking about Belarus now.
No,
I think the Europeans...
For a minute, I thought you were describing the attributes of China with whom you have a much better relationship. But anyways, I think that's something to think about at another point of time. That if you could do to Russia what you do to China, perhaps you might have a better relationship. Juuli, do you think about India at all? That's the question Ambassador Mohan Kumar has posed to you.
Yes, actually we do, but I think it's also a two-way street. So we at the embassy have tried to keep India much more on the picture. But prior to being posted to India, I heard also from my colleagues in Brussels that actually China is much more discussed of the institutions. But yes, we are of course trying to keep India much more on the picture. And during the most recent conference of the Estonian heads of representations in Tallinn in August, actually, we saw that our ministry, but also the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Estonian Parliament are very, very much interested in what's happening in India. And in February, right before the COVID crisis started, the India-Estonia Friendship Group from the Estonian Parliament, Riigikogu, was on a visit in India. So step by step, but also our diplomatic relations were established in '91 because we were already occupied when India became independent. So it's quite a new relationship also, and that's also the case with some other European countries. So the experience of the EU countries with external exchange or external communication is very, very different. For some, the Second World War ended in 1991. So I think that's where it's coming from. But a lot of work to do. We have a very good new Indian ambassador in Helsinki covering Estonia, Mr. Ravish Kumar. He's about to hand over his credentials soon. So hopefully more and more in the future.
And are you hopeful about the potential rearrangement of ties with Russia? Because you have a border?
Yes, we have a border with Russia, but as Tara pointed out, the recent events, I think it's aligning Europe even more, and the principles that were agreed in Brussels in 2016, the 5 principles guiding the engagement with Russia of the EU, are still in place, and it's very difficult to ignore the recent events, poisoning of Sergei Navalny, and also what happens with Belarus. Belarus is very close to us. Minsk is as close to Tallinn as Berlin is to Munich. So it's actually a very, very important.
It's complicated
problem for us.
Can I add
Sarah, please.
30 seconds?
Yeah, please.
So just to add on that, because I didn't say this, President Macron tried to launch a rapprochement with Russia last year, which created a massive stir in the rest of Europe. It was not coordinated, but he said we need to do this because we need Russia as a partner on a number of fronts, and we don't want the Sino-Russian rapprochement. It is going to go against European interests. 1 year after the conclusion of this rapprochement and the benefits that we should have benefited from, we don't see them. So, maybe it's going to take longer, but someone has tried to do it. And I think it's probably now up to the Russian side to show that they want to be our partners too. Just wanted to add on.
Ambassador Mohan Kumar, if you want to come in for 30 seconds, please do, because then I'll hand it over back to our organizers. Final word to you.
No, I think we should do everything in our power to cultivate the European Union. If it means we do much more vis-a-vis Brussels than Brussels deals with us, it's fine. If it means we have to cultivate Estonia, then vice versa, I would do that, because I think today India needs EU to be a pole. Thank you.
And I think that's a good note to end this conversation on and hand it back to Sanjoy. EU as a geopolitical actor is important for India.